Today, we're talking about two moms and a donor. So, we're talking to a married couple, Lori and Shannon, and they have two children, a 5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. And their friend, Dan, who lives in Australia, was their sperm donor. And what's interesting is that around the time that Lori and Shannon began their family, so did Dan in Australia. So we're going to talk a little bit about the bonus family and how these families have navigated basically having an extended family on another continent and all of the ways in which they are talking about this with their children. It's a really beautiful story. So enjoy Two Moms and a Donor.
Hi, welcome to Doing This Differently, a podcast that celebrates non-traditional family structures. I'm your host, Nicole Foley, a solo mom living in San Francisco with my daughter, Dylan. In each episode, we talk to families who are forging their own unique paths, and together we expand our definition of what family looks like.
So today we're talking to two moms and how they became a family of 4 with the help of a close friend in Australia who has a family of his own. So as we know, families come in all flavors, and we'll hear how the two families have created their own special blend. It's so exciting. A really beautiful story. So with that, I would like to introduce our guests. We have Lori Anahata, who is originally from the heartland of Omaha, Nebraska. She went to the University of Iowa to earn her degree and then moved to California in 2011 after writing down at a yoga training that one of her goals was to live by the ocean and the mountains. Good choice. This serendipitously led her to moving to Santa Cruz 6 months later, where she met her now wife, Shannon. Lori works in marketing and design operations, though has a rich professional history as a study abroad advisor, events producer, yoga instructor, and personal trainer. She now lives with her family in Richmond, California in the East Bay, and is manifesting her next passion project to offer children's DEI programming centering the LGBTQ plus experience through storytelling, music, movement, and art. That sounds amazing. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much.
And also with us is Shannon Anahata, originally from Los Angeles. Shannon has lived in California her whole life. She works in software development and with her kids, loves cooking, drawing, and going on outdoor adventures. Amazing. Welcome, Shannon.
Hey.
And thank you both so much for being here and sharing your story with us. It's really important for folks to hear about these more unique families, what I call coloring outside of the lines families, because there's so many of us, and it's only going to continue, which is great. So let's get into it. I have a few questions for you. First, I actually want to hear about your last name, Anahata. Like I said, I just learned your background in yoga, and I'm aware of the Anahata heart chakra. So I have a feeling there's a connection. I'm curious to hear a little bit about your story.
Yeah, that's right. Well, Lori here, and hello, listeners. I think both of us are, yoginis and have some background in yoga. And when we were getting married, we knew we wanted to have a family name that our future children would also have. And so we were trying to decide what to do with our last names. And, the combination of the two were going to be a mouthful, two German, like hyphenated names or like combined names, like Schwarz-Eiserman, Eiserman Wars. It just wasn't quite fitting.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely went around it, and I don't recommend choosing any word in the entire world to as a possibility for a last name. Is quite the endeavor, but one day after many, many, many weeks of trying to talk it through, Lori kind of just threw out their Anahata, and it has this beautiful melodic sound to it, such an incredible meaning to it as well, and we both just felt very connected to it and sat with it for a while and then decided to adopt it.
Yeah, I think we thought choosing a last name like Love or Amore or something was a little too on the nose. But as we were starting to try to find other words or other languages that kind of represented similarly like that, unconditional love, and even with the Anahata chakra being the balance of masculine and feminine and the like upper chakras and the lower chakras. There just seemed to be this really beautiful symbology that represented what we were trying to convey with our family name.
I love it. It's a beautiful name. It's a beautiful meaning. And I love that story. That's great. So I'm curious to hear, I know that for some of the guests I've talked to, growing up, you are in an environment that defines a lot of different social norms. And I know for me, I grew up with two parents. And so, becoming a solo parent, it was a big shift from the idea I had of what my future family was going to look like. And so I would love to hear from you both a little bit about the environments you grew up in and what shaped your worldview in terms of what family looked like. And we'll go from there.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off. I grew up in the Midwest. I come from a family of four. I have a mom and dad and an older sister. Most of the families that were around me also took on, that sort of traditional shape with a mom and a dad, nuclear family. Both of my parents were raised Catholic, so I did have some Christian influence, but also a little bit of more of like an earth-based spirituality. So not overly religious in the household, right? Generally, I'd say like Omaha was not a widely diverse environment, like compared to, other urban areas. In terms of demographics, it was definitely segregated. And I grew up in the suburbs, mostly, white neighbors, middle class. This also might sort of date me, but like even in my high school, right, like we didn't have a GSA, a Gay Straight Alliance yet. So I didn't really know of that many queer folks, right? I did have a cousin who was gay and out, and both my immediate but also my extended family, like they lovingly accepted him. And so I suppose that also helped like influence and also helped just to instill in me a sense of like celebration of diversity. And I think that probably also helped me feel more confident coming out as a bisexual when I was in high school. And then later at 25, when I actually ended a relationship and an engagement to a man in order to explore my identity at that time. And when I did come out to my family, even then they were super supportive. And the main question I remember my mom having was if I still wanted to actually be a mom, because, I'd always been pretty vocal about like my desire to raise a family. And so, of course, my response to that was like, yeah, definitely. I still want to raise a family. I still want to have children, but it just wasn't going to look the way that she had envisioned for me. Or honestly, at that point, like the way that I had envisioned it for me.
Sure. Yeah. I'm happy to hear that even in an environment that maybe is not typically open or receptive to LGBTQ, I'm happy to hear that you were met with acceptance and love around this. That's very heartening to hear.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that there's a privilege in that, and that's not every queer person's story. But I would say, fortunately, that's something that Shannon and I have in common, and that we've had that family support for the most part, since coming out.
Happy to hear that. What about you, Shannon?
So yeah, as the intro alluded to, I grew up in California. I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, and then further up in the Conejo Valley in a smaller city called Agoura Hills. I also grew up with a mom and a dad, and I am the oldest of three. So I have a younger brother and a younger sister. She's 8 years younger. So we kind of ran the gamut, and it was almost like two different households in that way, where I was, already a rowdy teenager by the time, my sister was just about in kindergarten, where our daughter is now, and pretty much was out of the house. But growing up in that family, I was raised Jewish, and I think the representation, even though there was a lot of diversity in and around Los Angeles, and we would travel into the city to different neighborhoods pretty regularly, basically every weekend, there wasn't a lot of diversity that I experienced in terms of just, sexual orientation or gender representation. I think Los Angeles very stereotypically is very gender conforming. And my parents really didn't talk about that level of diversity either. I have really clear memories of hearing about gay people, and it was mostly around AIDS. And one of my mom's best friends was a gay man, and he died of AIDS. And so I remember very briefly and vaguely hearing about that. And, I think it instilled a lot of fear in my mom around what it means to be gay or queer, and the safety around that as well. So I even though it wasn't a conservative upbringing, I think it was a sheltered one, in the sense of just not wanting to expose me to a lot of diversity, in the hopes that maybe that would mean I could walk a straight and narrow path and be very safe. And so, yeah, it didn't dawn on me that there were many options for me once I realized that I was queer. And, I round up to women, but generally, don't fully align with that either. I feel more masculine of center. And so I think there were just a lot of questions around, how do you create a family in that sense, with that kind of upbringing, and not really having a lot of, or really any examples of what that possibility could be.
I was just in LA for a conference, and I've been to LA. I couldn't count how many times, but I've never thought specifically around how gender conforming it is. And as soon as you said that, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so true.
Yeah.
And you don't think about it, because there is so much diversity in so many different ways. But I can also see, it makes sense, the experience you just described, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it really confused me generally in my sexuality. I was just like, I don't understand how I'm supposed to represent myself, and that I'm not really into dresses or being super femme, or, it just didn't, it took a while for me to really understand where my sexuality could take me, and my representation of myself. To even think about finding a partner and having a family, it was way far away.
Interesting. Yeah. Makes sense. So speaking of which, tell us a little bit about your path to parenthood. And you've talked a little bit about sort of the worldview you had about what parenting or what a family could look like, or just that you weren't quite sure, Shannon, to your point, what that could possibly look like. So tell me a little bit about how you came to be your amazing family of 4.
Well, yeah, sort of kind of where do we begin, right? I think
at the beginning,
just when we met, as I shared, I had moved out to California in 2011, and we met fairly shortly after that. And I wouldn't say it was in our very first date, but pretty soon thereafter, we were immediately having the, so do you want to have kids conversation? Because at that point, I was just about 30. We both were, at this point in our lives where it was we didn't have a lot of time to, if we did want to start down that path. And so it was more of a priority to just be sure that we were aligned on that. And then, as we were, continuing on in our relationship, and obviously fell very deeply in love, and I flash forward, we were approaching our wedding, the conversations just moved from more hypothetical, right, to serious. What would we want that family to look like? Did we envision a donor, a known donor, an anonymous donor? Would we want to, pursue a family member, because of course there are some queer folks that end up going in that direction. But we were really aligned that wasn't the path for us. And so we had sort of a short list at that point of potential known donors, because I think we also aligned on wanting to have someone who we could have known to our children. At that point, not actually knowing the extent of what that would look like, but we felt more drawn to that as an experience than having an anonymous donor or selecting a donor from a sperm bank, for example. And so, yeah, I mean, again, they're at our wedding, like we have some of our best men in our lives standing up next to us, supporting our marriage and our, future together. And one of our best men, Dan, had come all the way over from Australia, and he was really just kind of asking us questions to help us crystallize, like, what would we be looking for in a donor? What were the qualities of someone? What was that vision?
And he wasn't on that short list. He, again, in Australia, I think, Dan and I had met prior to that and spent time together, but he was somebody who was kind of in and out of our lives, not someone we both talked with regularly. So he wasn't even really someone we had put on that list to consider.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, it's probably good for the case of the story to say that, taking a step back in the past, like I studied abroad in Australia in my early 20s and, met Dan at that time. We had maintained a really sweet friendship over the years. As a dual citizen, he would come back to America almost every year. And as a study abroad advisor, encouraging students to travel to that region of the world, I also had the opportunity to go to Australia multiple times, even after I studied abroad. And so, yeah, we maintained a friendship. And around the time that I came out at 25, we did have this sort of classic conversation that, sometimes teens or like 20-year-olds will have, where it was like, hey, look, if neither of us have kids in 20 years, and that's something that we really, really, are driven to do, like, let's just co-parent and make that happen. It can be platonic, but like, we'll help each other out kind of thing. And so, yeah, who knew at that point that, about 10 years later, we'd be actually manifesting that dream.
Right. I mean, you're really planting a seed there.
It's true. That's
right. Incredible. Yeah.
And
Full circle.
I guess, like, back to the wedding, we were having these conversations, and we had our wedding in late August, very close to Burning Man. And so we had planned on going to the playa, for any listeners that are familiar. And we called it our Burning Moon. And these conversations sort of continued over the course of that week. But then there was really just this very, magical moment where we were all on our bicycles and kind of riding out onto the playa, and the sun was setting, and
it's like probably this like pink purple sky.
Yeah,
it's so visual.
Yeah, it really is a magical container, or it can be, being at Burning Man, and just that open curiosity that Dan had been showing over the many days that we had now been spending together, with constructing this dream of a wedding and then going to this dream of a celebration afterward in this incredibly built city of Black Rock City and Burning Man. He just stopped us. Like, he was basically riding us home to our camp. He was staying at another one, and we just stopped. And he turned to us and shared with us that he would be so honored to be considered as a donor for us, and that he really considered it one of, the greatest gifts that he could give and greatest honors of his life, to be able to partake in this journey with us. And that, it being such an idyllic romantic moment being there in this space, and we had just been married and totally blissed out. Of course, it felt so good, but what really struck both Lori and me is as the conversations continued after that moment, it was the first time that she and I truly felt aligned in a person we had talked with, really feeling like the one we would want to move forward with and being our donor. And it's such a tricky thing, choosing a known donor. You really don't know if it's going to work out. You kind of take one step at a time. And so even that first step feeling so solid was, it's just a really magical time.
Yeah. I have a few questions. So you had a short list and he was not on it. So did he just bring this up with you, or had you already said something to him to indicate that you would be open to doing this with him? Or like, I'm just curious, did he just say, hey, by the way, I want in on this?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was essentially that. Like, there might have been a moment where, that very day that Shannon and I might have kind of looked at each other, and I don't even know if it was verbal or not, but maybe there might have been like some lights going on a little bit, like, oh, wow, this sort of list of qualities that we've been describing, like, are we actually seeing that right in front of us? Like, it was almost maybe a little like too under the nose.
I think in my mind, it was that he lived in Australia and how would that even ever work? So it hadn't crossed my mind at all, but he kept asking. And I remember there was a moment even before the wedding, because Dan had come out and he was spending time with us really the week before we were even getting married, just supporting us and being an amazing friend. And Lori and Dan went to go pick up some stuff for the wedding one random day before. And she got home and just said, I think Dan was asking about maybe being our donor. And I was like, no, he wouldn't ask that. Doesn't make any sense. Like, it still wasn't clicking for me. So I think, maybe in your mind, he was already planting those seeds. So it was kind of arriving, and the two of them were arriving there before he was being very blunt about it. And then it made a lot of sense. And we still had so many logistics to figure out. But no, it wasn't. I think he was just genuinely curious. It really started with, are you thinking about kids and what might that look like? And we did. We were open. We had that short list. And maybe there was a moment of him being like, why am I not on that list?
Yeah, right. Is there a spot for number 6? Yeah, because I can also imagine, having been to Burning Man 5 times myself, and I know how magical, like, just when you describe that, I'm like, I see it. I absolutely see it, going for that ride together and being like, wait a second. It totally makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And so, I would imagine, like, it's easy to get caught up in a moment like that. And what you were also describing is sort of like the follow through, like he, like, afterwards, like, no, seriously, I mean this. And I can only imagine just having, that's just such a magical moment. I mean, just again, I can so visualize it. It's very easy to imagine.
Yeah, that's right. And I think we tried to really keep that sentiment sort of in our heart, which we'll describe as we're telling this story here. But as we were met with some setbacks, and where it didn't all just happen as smoothly as we imagined, but having that moment where it was like time just stood still and it felt like the stars were all aligning, like knowing that was the impetus, that's when the dream really started to form. Like, I think that has carried us through.
And also, I'm just thinking in terms of, there's so many decisions to be made whenever you're taking a different route to having a family. There's so many decisions. There's so many different elements to it. And I'm just acknowledging, like, I can understand, and having had my own experience with this, it's sometimes you're just like, it's that little nudge, like, like making the decision between anonymous and known donor and that type of thing. And I love hearing how clear this was as a move. That's great.
Yeah, we're just aware at this moment how unique that really is to have a known donor where everything really comes through and that it becomes as special as it has for our families, both of our families, and what that bond has been like and also grown into does feel very unique and special.
For sure. And Lori, you alluded to kind of the road to your firstborn. Can you take us through that? And also very curious to hear about Dan and his family.
Yeah, definitely. Well, as Shannon said, there was that whole romantic notion, but then that's right. Like the reality kind of kicked in. We really needed to start working through those logistics. How are we going to get him back? Like he actually had just started dating someone. And so I think he was also grappling himself with, was it something to share? Maybe not actually ask, but certainly have a conversation. And it turned out that he did want to share and ask his girlfriend if she was supportive. And she was supportive wholeheartedly. And this woman is now actually his wife, and they have 3 children of their own.
Amazing.
But knowing that she was kind of there at the beginning is also a special piece. But yeah, it took about a year and some change from that like magical sunset, right, to our first attempt. We really did have a lot of conversations around just the vision, our vision of what kind of involvement he would have. Would it look more like an extended family? Like, would we want them or him, to be involved in birthdays or holidays, or like, would we have family vacations? Would we, visit there or here? And all along those conversations, again, repeatedly, it just felt like we were very much aligned. And we knew that some of these things would change, and it would very much depend on our children and their involvement and their desires around what kind of relationship they would want to form with their donor. But we actually wrote all of this up into a document. So we had both like a family vision, but then certainly we needed to make sure that we had everything tightened up, like legally, just around, parent rights and whatnot. But yeah, we had visions of like high school exchanges of our kids, and that, maybe we'd at some point move to Australia, or, they would come here. And some of that has played out, but, some got a little paused given the pandemic. And
that'll do it.
But yeah, the first time they came over to the US was in 2016. Again, that was, about 2 years actually, or a year and a half after our wedding. And the 4 of us, I remember sitting down and had this sort of ritual to kind of set intentions and call in our future children. And, even during that visit when Dan was coming to store his sperm, we did a couple of months of fresh attempts, inner cervical inseminations, but those were unsuccessful. And so, we did have the sperm stored, so we were able to continue on with a midwife and do IUIs, inner uterine inseminations. And it took 8 months before we saw those 2 lines, and were elated that we were pregnant. But as is often the case, first pregnancy, it resulted in a miscarriage. And we were also kind of running out of sperm. And so we did arrange for him to come back to the US again. So here we are, like more financial investment. But at each of these turns, we just, came back together, and it was like, are we still yeses. And at each point we were. But again, we were a little bit defeated. We tried a few more times and it was unsuccessful. And so I think that was a little bit of a moment of like, okay, is this still the right plan?
Side note.
I'm really glad that Lori mentioned her pregnancy loss. It's a topic. Well, it's something that so many women experience, and I know so many people in my world, they don't talk about it, and as a private person, I can understand sometimes not wanting to talk about it so publicly, but it's something that I want anyone listening to this to understand. It is so common and a part of so many women's experience. And I think it is important to talk about it because I think as we listen to other people's stories, whether it's how they coped or just knowing in Lori's case, they ended up having 2 children. So there can be really positive outcomes, but I just want to also acknowledge how intense and devastating it is for people to experience pregnancy loss. And my hope is that with time, more and more women feel more comfortable talking about it and sharing their stories.
And back to the conversation.
And some of that really was around just what we learned of being the complete black hole that is understanding fertility and, bodies with uteruses, is just astounding how we finally did go to a fertility clinic just to get a consultation even, and they're so confident when they talk to you, and then you really find out as you start trying to dive in and ask questions, they have no idea. They don't know how any of it works. Mm-hmm. They know if they can just get all the parts they need into a petri dish, then they can kind of get you somewhere. But even then, even going all the way to IVF, doing a transfer, there's no guarantee. They don't have any idea what happens once that transfer happens. They just know that they can give you like a really good chance. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was also a bit untethering and disheartening, where we just wanted somebody to help us understand where things maybe were going wrong or where we could improve. And there was just no way of knowing. And so
it's really like anyone's guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then it just really made us wonder, wow, now this is feeling challenging, where it felt amazing and so aligned. Our donor is in Australia. We don't really have fresh sperm ever. And maybe we need that. Maybe we need more. Or maybe the timing just is still a little wonky. Or there were so many questions that were being cast. And so it really did bring us back to this state of, is it time for us to just find a different donor? Should we move to something that might feel a little bit easier in the process?
Yeah, and we went back to that short list, and
I'm so sorry. Hang on one second. I thought that I had until 1. Hey. Well, okay. Hi, sweetheart. My daughter is back early from the park.
This is very much our lives.
Right. Totally. Yeah. This is the first time this has happened, because normally I know that she comes back at 1. Okay. She's not happy about this. No. Okay.
Side note.
What's happening here is that my parents, who are in town, went out with my nanny and Dylan for the day, and they came back. I had told everybody I needed until 1 p.m. to finish this interview, and they showed up at 1:15, and and Dylan very much wanted to hang out, and it's one of these things that's so universal. I'm like, I'm needing something, and also my guests were super gracious, and also on a schedule where we all had a hard stop at 1. This is parenthood. And I just love how realistic that situation was. And it was comical, even though I don't look that amused in the moment. It's just, there's so many things. This is something that with all of our episodes, there's been a time constraint. And so I'm just super conscious of that, wanting to be respectful of people's time. And so in this instance, you hear Dylan in the background crying for quite some time because she didn't get a chance to hang out. And also what you can't see is, all the equipment and it just looked really exciting to her. She wanted to join in on the fun. But anyway, just so much respect to all parents. We're there's a whole circus happening behind us that we are somehow skilled at hiding, and it is what it is. So I love that popped up here.
And back to the conversation.
So we actually went back to that short list and even went as far as to have a couple other incredible men do sperm motility testing, right? But when we came back and the four of us got back on a call together, I think we really did. We just returned to that initial intention and that ritual that we had together, and we just recommitted, right, to going the distance and taking sort of every step possible, and just wanting to at least exhaust the opportunities, which meant pooling some funds together and pursuing IVF. We know that that's a privileged place to even have that as an option, and as Shannon said, like, we knew there were no guarantees. But in our case, once we did make that decision, things went, fairly smoothly. The retrieval was pretty successful. It resulted in 3 genetically normal embryos, and that first transfer was also successful, and we now have our 5.5-year-old. But yeah, then I think one of the ways that we needed to adjust our vision was that initially we thought that we'd start trying for our second with Shannon carrying when our first was about 1. And boy, we hit that point and we were just like, no way are we ready to get pregnant again. We were just starting to get some sleep, and we could not imagine like having 2 kids under 2.
I'll tell you, my definition of superhero is at this point just anyone with 2 kids. I just have such a different lens after going through the experience myself, and so I can only imagine, and especially when you see the families where the children are very close in age, I bow down to the 2 of you, and I bow down to the other families who are like, hey, let's have these close together. And it's like, that's probably going to be amazing when they're grown or even like a little bit older. But those early years, it's just phenomenal. Like the superhero-ness.
Yeah. Well, and Dan and his family, they do have 2 kids who are a little bit closer in age, not quite a year, but about 1.5 years. And yeah, we definitely watched them go through that process as well, and were completely mesmerized by that superpower. And it did the timing ended up being so sweet as well, in the sense that we found out, that Dan and his wife were pregnant, and then just 2 months later, Lori was pregnant. And we were already going through that IVF process. And so it's just been so neat too that, our first 2 kids are 2 months apart.
Exactly. It's so incredible.
Yeah.
Like bonus siblings.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And we had to have those conversations too of what do we want to call each other, and, how do we want them to be known at first? Like Lori was saying earlier, the kids will ultimately decide over time, but how do we want to refer to each other? And that certainly was a conversation as well.
Let's dig into that. Yeah, I'm really curious because this is, there's so many unique elements to your story, but this one to me is like, wow, let me hear more about what were those conversations like? What were the conversations between yourselves and Dan and his wife, and then how you've been talking to your children about this, because it's beautiful. From what I understand, I mean, it's just everything that you have built together is just this incredibly unique family. And I take it away.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of the naming, right? We definitely were like, kind of tried on a few different things. We're like, uncle doesn't really quite cut it. Aunt and uncle, auntie. Our kids have plenty of like aunties and uncles. And then we were like, there certainly is this sort of special relationship that one might imagine of like a godparent. But, there's also like a religious connotation there. And we're like, it goes beyond that. And then we were like, oh, is it just literally calling them like, this is my donor dad? Or, we didn't feel like dad was appropriate, right? Given that they were creating their own family, and we wanted to still separate out that, Dan was a dad to his children. And, that our children, they don't have a dad. They have two moms, or a mom and an Ima, right? Hebrew for mom. But yeah, we kind of ended up landing on Papa Dan, and donor Dan just felt very like conventional, or I don't know, like medical,
technical.
I was going to say, it sounds clinical. Yeah. This is your donor dad.
Papa kind of has this like, just there's a familial element, but it's not dad or daddy or something. So yeah, we kind of tried that on, and I think Dan also really,
I think he ultimately proposed Papa Dan.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And we also use Mama for his wife, Mama Ray.
Mm-hmm.
I love
and then, just playing with also like sibling, like, is this your sister and brother, or for the kids? And at this point, we go with just like your Aussie siblings, so your Aussie fam.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah.
And vice versa, like we're the American fam.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been talking about this a lot since before these children were born. And so we have, again, all of our own vocabulary for it and ways that we speak to it. And our kids are now just becoming old enough to maybe start to understand and realize truly what it means in terms of the family that we have built. So it's also been a journey, just really quickly, anecdotally. They came out to visit us last year in September, which was amazing. And we hadn't seen them since 2019. And, when we were all together, Lori and I, we have books about how families are made and the diversity of families. And, Sierra our daughter can easily, say like, what makes a baby? It's a sperm and an egg. And, she knows the whole thing. She knows the story of how she was conceived overall. And we came to find that, that they didn't, that Dan and his wife, their kids didn't know about what makes a baby, how their, half siblings were created. And so that was an interesting moment for us to just really think through, well, how do we want to talk about that with us all being together, and now having children of an age where they're curious, they're talking about it themselves. So obviously our daughter knows how to talk about it, and their kids really aren't going to have the context as much. And then we also had kind of a sticky point with Papa Dan, because our kids were calling him that. And his kids hadn't really been braced for that was a thing. They had heard it over, WhatsApp conversations and phone calls, but it was very in passing and casual. And so being immersed in it and being together for weeks, it was only a few days in that Dan's older kid, the one our kids' age, both, at the time 4, just stopped us and said, his name isn't Papa Dan. Don't call him that. Like, that's not his name. His name is Dan. And
or like, he's my dad, like, and
so we never really said it that way, but that was the implication, right? Is like,
Sure. Yeah.
There was an insecurity coming up there. And so it's also just navigating those moments together of, what are we building? What does it mean? And, we spent, again, weeks together, and that insecurity very quickly faded. And it was really clear that, like, Dan is his dad.
Yeah.
And that's not going to change.
And we also used it as a really beautiful educational moment, right?
Right.
Because
Exactly. I was curious about this. Yeah. How did you
we were
address it?
able to bring out our books, the What Makes Baby, and kind of talk through that, and also introduced them to some of our other favorite books that kind of portray families that look like ours, like two mom families, but also just families with donors. And Jack's Safari is one of our favorites.
I have that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How Nova Got a Star in Her Eye. These are some of our favorites. And yeah, it was that learning opportunity. And I mean, I think certainly those conversations will continue to happen because, their second is now 4, ours is 2.5. So we're starting to have a little bit more of those conversations with our young one. And then they had a third just 6 weeks ago, right?
Amazing.
So,
wow.
3
superheroes.
Yeah. Oh, I know. Seriously. But, it makes sense that a family like ours would be centering that conversation a little more than, a cis hetero family with a mom and a dad, right? But of course, it just helped, helped us realize that it's so important that those conversations are happening at an even earlier age, right? In all families. Just like the conversations that we want to have about diversity in our house, about race and ethnicity and different abilities and just all of the ways in which families and, people are unique. And, we can talk about single parent families or multi-generational families. And even if it's not the way that our family looks, like, let's still have that conversation and help build that language and vocabulary with our kids.
I love that. And you've touched on this a little bit, but so big question, how's it going? How's it all going? Having two, and, you're both working individuals, and then you have, I know that you had mentioned to me that you're going to spend the holidays in Australia. Like, I'm just curious, like, how's everything going? Because I know that, the visit you just described was a year ago, and a year in a child's life is just 1,000 years. So I'm just curious, like, if new questions have come up, how's life? How are you all balancing family and all that good stuff?
Yeah, I mean, 2 kids is a lot, and we knew that 2 kids would be a lot, but it turns out that 2 kids turns out to be quite a lot once that second kid is no longer a baby.
Although it's a lot when they're a baby.
It is. It absolutely is. Yeah. Not to say that, like, oh, it's a cakewalk for the first year, but relatively speaking, the ramp up from this is a human that's just going to be along for the ride to, oh, they want to build their own ride now. And so does our oldest. And we're on a different train here. And what is happening is really quite a lot. And it is, people have talked about how it's exponential in terms of that energy output and expectation. And there's just no way to believe it until you're in it. And then, yeah, oh yeah, that is what exponential means. It's a lot.
Right. I've heard 2 is 20. Yeah.
Right. But, fortunately, we have kind of come up at this point where, we're out of the baby phase, at least, and we're starting to see our kids, with this 3-year difference, starting to play and engage with one another a little bit more. Yeah. And so we can also just like see how that could potentially develop as we go. And that is giving us a little bit of a break. That was even originally a part of why we wanted to have a second, and the plan to have give our, first a sibling. We both have siblings, right? And so that was just, part of it, that we imagined that there would be a friendship that would develop there. Who knows how it will continue to evolve over time. But so I think we are now like getting a little bit of that break, even though there's elements that are more hard. And yeah, I mean, I think going to Australia and spending months there, yeah, we'll get to again, see now our 2.5-year-old, or he'll be, closer to 3 at that time. Like, what questions will he have? There's a baby in the mix. And so
Yeah.
maybe that will help. Like maybe that will give us an in to talk more about like, oh, right. Well, what makes a baby? And, whose sperm made this baby? Whose sperm made you? But whose egg made you? And I think there's some opportunity there for that continued learning.
And it does go back to that educational piece. It's, and it's in the long run, I'm really grateful that our kids get that level of diversity, because it really creates a human that has so much more of an open mind from the get-go to understand that you're different in some way. And that really is a gift. But it's also hard. And in that sense, the types of questions that have come up are less questions for our oldest and more. The main one is, why am I different? But the bigger statement is, it's hard not having a dad sometimes. And by that, she really means she's just the only kid without one. In her preschool, she was the only kid who, didn't have a mom and a dad, and instead had two moms. And even though everyone was really receptive and really curious in a friendly, well-meaning way, she was kind of like that, lion in a cage where everyone would walk up and stare and be like, ooh, that's different. And as a 5-year-old, but really at any age, that's an uncomfortable feeling to kind of be that lab rat. Mm-hmm. And so that's really where the conversations have moved to, is talking with her about that, what she's entitled and to say, and also just coaching her on things she can say when people ask her about having two moms. Although she's brilliant at responding, it's more so that exhaustion that comes with being the other in a place.
Of course. Yeah, this is a 2.5. My daughter is already, I didn't realize toddlers talked about this, but it's come up a couple of times in like, where's your dad? And I thought I had more time, but yeah, I can imagine as they get older, and I think I'll probably be calling you both for some coaching on best responses, because it breaks my heart to think that she'll feel othered. And if it wasn't this, I'm sure it'll be other things. Every child feels othered at some point. But I can imagine it's very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and we have been able to, like you mentioned, Shannon, like provide her with a script, mostly kind of spurred by having read some books, where, it almost models it in the book. And then we get to be like, oh, so what can you say if someone says, do you have a dad, or where's your dad? And we even got to hear that someone at a wedding that we attended asked her that very question. That adult came up to us later and was like, I just want to tell you, like, your daughter ended up saying like, oh no, I have a donor dad. And they were like, oh, is he here? And she was like, oh no, he lives in Australia. And like, she basically just like not only said the things that we had almost coached her on, but she elaborated and she had her own story to tell. And it just really helped us feel like, right, she's integrating all of this. And
exactly. And it sounds like with comfort too. Like she's able to express it with comfort, which I think is the biggest part, right? It's like, it's one thing to understand your circumstances. It's another thing to embrace it enough to be comfortable talking about it. That's incredible. Have there been new conversations between you and Dan and his wife? Because obviously it's one thing to make this decision before there's even a baby growing in your belly, right? But I'm curious, like, have there been touch points along the way about like, this is coming up, how are you addressing this? Have there been conversations between the families?
We've had a couple of moments. I think when it was, early 2020 and we started to move forward again, and at that point Shannon was planning on carrying. And so we were using the remaining sperm that we had banked. And those first couple of attempts were successful. And of course, then March 2020 hit and our clinic closed and everyone was in lockdown. And so we definitely had to go through this like re-examining of, are we even sure that we want to bring another human into the world? Like, what are we doing here? And, by the time sort of July rolled around, the promise of vaccinations was coming and we knew that this wasn't going to be forever. And we were able to tap back into our initial family vision. But at that point, we also had a check-in with Dan and Murray. And because we were like, maybe it's just time to get the show on the road. We still have a couple of embryos, but that would mean that we wouldn't be having our second child with Shannon's genetics. And it would be that one of those embryos with, Dan and my genetics would be our second. And so I think there was a moment of like just touching base on that. And
yeah, just realizing in a family dynamic where they now had 2 kids, how would it even be feasible in the timing that we wanted or needed to maybe get more sperm? And but it was more of a logistical thing and kind of deciding on our part as well, how did we want to move forward there? And beyond that, it's just all felt really naturally good in terms of celebrating each other, celebrating our families, celebrating holidays and birthdays. And I think that distance is really helpful in that sense. And the fact that we both have built the families that we wanted, there's not, it just ended up so beautifully and parallel in that way that, they had their baby first, but barely first. And then we had our baby and, they had another one, but we were absolutely satisfied with our first at that time and overwhelmed, in fact, and, beyond what our original plans were when we thought about having 2 children before we had any. And so in that sense, we've really had such rich, fortunate stories of how our families eventually came to be. And it allowed for us to just look at each other with love and adoration and support.
And a lot of our, more regular conversations, I mean, we just have such a beautiful relationship. They really are just extended family. And so, we'll talk regularly. We'll have phone chats. We'll hear about how their weeks went, or we'll do video chats every couple of weeks. And it's not like we're constantly having to like talk through logistics or something now. It's just like, all right, these are our families, and how's school going? And, you've got a new job. Tell me more about that. Or, so it's just really the kind of relationship that it would be when you do call your godparent or your closest aunt and uncle, or, where most of the time it's not doesn't need to be like a part of the conversation. And then in the moments where something has come up or a question comes up, or, our daughter will paint them in like a family painting that she's done at kindergarten or something. It's like we get to share and like celebrate the wins, and also just as close family, like we also get to hold each other in our losses. And it just almost feels like a cherry on the top that there's this kind of biological thread that unites us. But ultimately, we are just building a loving, familial, extended family relationship. Sometimes I wish they lived a little closer. Like, I don't think necessarily be hanging out every weekend. Like that might complicate.
Exactly. I think it actually, to your earlier point, I feel like the distance actually serves you all. Yeah.
But maybe if they just lived like a state away, that would be
true.
kind of nice.
But not such a long flight away.
But of course, there is something unique about it, and I think it helps to also instill like this international interest in our children, and we get to like learn about what Australia is like, and who knows how that will play out over time. But again, maybe, our kids will be studying abroad in these respective countries, and, that will be a special thing for them in the future.
And it's probably in their DNA, because Aussies are such travelers. It's probably just embedded in the DNA.
That's
right. Incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I have one last question, which is, to me, hearing your story, I'm like, gosh, this is really best case scenario, like in so many ways. I mean, in every way. And I know that just in my own journey and figuring out like, okay, I guess I'm doing this. Like, I would have loved to hear more stories, more people's experiences with making a less than conventional choice in a variety of different ways, right? And I'm wondering if you have any wisdom that you'd like to share for anybody contemplating a similar path, whether it's, being two moms, or, asking a friend to be the donor dad, like any one of those things. Like, what would you, in terms of like encouraging somebody who might be listening, who's just like, I don't know, it just seems like maybe I can't do this for X, Y, and Z reason. I'd love to hear from you on what wisdom you'd like to share.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. It's true. I mean, I have a couple organizations that I'd love to recommend. I'll start there, but I think we can add our own more like kind of personal support and encouragement. But yes, Family Equality is an amazing organization. They're a leading organization in the movement for LGBTQ plus family equality and fighting for a world where everyone can experience the unconditional love and belonging of family. They have just some amazing resources, workshops and conversations around the legality of donor relationships, and sort of templates for documentation. They also partner with Collage, which is an organization that supports people of all ages who have LGBTQ plus parents or guardians. And Collage, so they sponsor an annual family week in Provincetown, Rhode Island, for programming for what they call like queer spawn, like kids with at least one or more LGBTQ plus parents or guardians. But they also have a bunch of resources that's for donor inseminated kids and adults who are considering having children through donor insemination. So when I had learned about this organization from actually a friend of mine who is a second generation DI kid, donor inseminated kid. So he was a donor to a friend, helping her have a child, but he himself has two moms and was a donor inseminated kid. So it's really kind of special starting to see that there's now almost like multi-generations, and that these individuals, donor inseminated now adults, can speak to their experience, right? So we knew of a curated kind of article that Collage presented that was, the voices from DI adults and their perspectives on, the whole spectrum. Some of them who had known donors, what they liked and disliked about that, how the relationship changed,
Oh, that's great.
And adults who have unknown donors and, the pros and cons of that from their perspective. And I think it really helped us to understand there's a full spectrum here, right? And we had our own vision of like what we wanted, but kind of starting to understand that our kids are going to have their own experience. And it helped to read some voices of other, people who had kind of experienced this, like the first meeting of their donor versus kids who, like our kids, were going to know from a very, very young age.
Spending holidays together.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, I think actually just reading through that, and it was that publication that we also provided to both Dan and some of those others from our short list when we were having these conversations. Because it's one thing for a donor to be like, yeah, I'm totally on board, how can I get you my sperm? But like, the reality is that this is going to be a lifelong relationship that we don't understand entirely, like we don't know how that it's going to evolve. And a lot of that is going to be based on our kids' desires as they grow older. And so I think trying to provide some of these resources for our potential donors to help them go through their own process of considering what this could potentially mean for them in their future. Like, I think that was one approach that we took.
I think that's extremely wise. And also, I really, you've mentioned this a few times, just that the children are really going to lead the way in terms of what feels right to them, which I think is also very wise. Yeah, it's something that they'll have to navigate, and but it just seems like everything so far is pointing to it's a bonus family. It's a good thing. It's a very positive thing. And I think as they grow older, they're going to only appreciate more having more family in the world. One of the things that I've said is more love is more love. Like, it's just, that's all that it is. There's no downside to it. Yeah.
And I'll also add, we gave our potential donors names of a couple of other men who had been donors, like known donors, just as a resource, like in case they wanted to have those conversations. Yeah. Any other wisdom that you want to share?
I think you said it all really well, and just being clear on a vision yourself seems to really be the way to go. Laurie and I talked a lot about what we wanted and what our ideal was, and I think, again, we were so lucky that it came to be, and that doesn't happen for everyone, or maybe even a lot of people, but we were really clear on what we wanted to begin with, and that was super helpful. And then leaning on these communities, as Laurie said, is so invaluable.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of resources even through, the Sperm Bank of California, or, should someone listening, be deciding to go down an anonymous donor path, versus the known donor path that we've been describing, definitely resources with your local sperm bank. We've heard some wonderful, there's great books out there. I'm happy to provide, a list of those things to.
Yeah, that would be great. That would be great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just know that you very likely will have to sort of evolve the plan and return to it, and adapt as things inevitably will become, maybe challenging, or you might have some hardship along the way. But I think for us, it was just, holding that sense of like hope and trust, and, almost like unwavering dedication and commitment to our vision. And even if we had to adjust, had we gone with another donor along the way, like being able to still have the heart of what we desired, at every step of the way. I think that's helped be the core.
I think those have been the two most recent things that you said, I think for me have been the biggest takeaways in terms of a successful experience in that, which is the alignment, like really, really and truly aligned. I know that in my own experience of like navigating what made the most sense to me, there was an experience where I was just like, I can feel that there's a lack of alignment here. And in terms of the person's partner. And I think that it's really important to listen to that. If you're not feeling like, I don't know that this is, I don't know if I'm feeling the alignment. So I feel like that's something that you really, really had. And yeah, I think just having the wisdom to know that things are not going to be static and that you have to be willing to just adjust as things, because life is not neat, it's so just knowing to keep checking in, it sounds like, to make sure that alignment continues.
Yeah. And keep the hope though in the heart, that there's so many different ways to create a family, and sometimes, unfortunately, you might even have to let that go entirely, that it will be your own biological person. But, there's a lot of different ways to have children in your lives and to have a family, and, certainly just cheering any listener on. And, we're happy to be resources for anyone to contact if you have questions or support, just looking for support. We're really an open book around this sort of thing. So yeah, if there's any way that we can help answer any further questions or just provide some encouragement, we're
That's so
we're
generous. That's so generous. Thank you. I do think like the whole reason why I started this is that I wish I had this available to me when it took me like 5 years to really figure out what I was going to do. So I appreciate that. I think that I want people to have that resource available so that they can ask more questions. But I just want to thank you both so much. This was such a lovely conversation. As I said, I mean, what an incredible story, and it's so beautiful. And kudos to Papa Dan.
And Mama Ray and, the whole fam. We've actually, of course, thought that a great potential follow-up to this will be to maybe get us all on a call, when we're visiting. So maybe there'll be a part 2 for listeners to tune into in the future.
I love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us for Two Moms and a Donor. What a beautiful story, right? I still have all the visuals of what their bike ride on the playa at Burning Man and the follow through. I mean, this is incredible. And this beautiful blended family, it's the first I've ever known like that. And I imagine that's the same for a lot of folks. But kudos to all of them for just figuring out how to create this beautiful bonus family, that both sides of the family benefit from each other, and also the idea of letting the children guide the way of how this is going to go. Super wise and amazing as Lori and Shannon are.
Also, if you're part of a unique family and you want to have a conversation with me, please reach out. Doingthisdifferently.com. Happy to chat with you. I think it's really important, as I've had these conversations with all these different families, normalizing that what makes your family unique is really helpful. It also helps children learn about inclusion and opens their minds as well as their parents, and gives everybody a shared language and understanding of what it means to be a unique family. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll see you next time.